Okay, so we're going to keep going. All these awesome questions. Today I'm going to tackle two of them. And the first one is probably one of the first ideas that was mentioned. And I think Josh kind of kicked it off with talking about how people believe there's a different God of the Old Testament and then he seems different, right? So I think the probing was, how do we respond to people that believe these things, right? So how do we respond to those who believe the Old Testament God is a God of wrath and vengeance, and then the good God of the New Testament is just this God of fluff and love, right? But I think we need to understand this is a misconception among unbelievers and even some believers, right? It's not just unbelievers that believe this. And it's kind of somewhat understandable. I mean, if you know the Bible, right? If you read through the Old Testament and then you turn the page to the New Testament, there's a lot that changes between that, right? So there's 400 years in between Old Testament page and the New Testament first page, right? You go from the Jews being in captivity to Persians to being ruled over by Rome all of a sudden. And then you have all these new religious systems and leaders called Pharisees and Sadducees that didn't exist in the Old Testament. So it's almost like, hey, there's a new system. The God no longer has to be mean. So all of a sudden he's love because of this system, right? So it's understandable that even believers see that. But there's reasons that they see this and they believe that. So all that to say, with so many changes and years having passed by, the fact that the New Testament revelations of God are also somewhat delivered differently than they are in the Old Testament. So there's another contribution to people believing that God changed somewhere throughout that process. But honestly, anyone that makes that claim, bottom line, they have not read through the Bible in its entirety. They don't understand. End of story. They have not read the entire Bible. We here know that the Bible is God's progressive revelation of himself to us through historical events, through the Israelites, through all of the tribes of Israel, right? And we know that the New Testament is the fulfillment of those promises that he made to redeem mankind. So we all know that. So rather than focusing on what we already know, I thought I'm going to offer some suggestions, a couple of suggestions of how to respond to someone. Like, what can we say? What can we do? How can we engage in a conversation with somebody who believes this, right? First of all, debating is not the answer, okay? It never works. A better approach is asking questions to understand, right? This can often debunk their opinions and hopefully encourage them to search for deeper truth, the actual truth as to what they're believing, right? So let's start with just a few questions to pose to get us started. So question number one, asking someone, what led you to this opinion? So understanding the reason for this belief can offer a better pathway for discussion, right? Is this something they believe because it was passed on to them from family members or other influences in their life? Did they have a personal experience where they felt God abandoned them? So they've put this up as a safeguard, a defense mechanism, right? This isn't just true of this one false belief that we are tackling today. A lot of this can apply to other false beliefs that you find that other people are approaching you with. But many misconceptions or lies about God stem from that very issue. They've been hurt by God. They felt like God abandoned them. He didn't show up. He didn't answer this prayer. So they develop these opinions based on their own personal experience, right? Or they're wounded by other Christians, right? And so I don't want to be like that. God must be like that. If that Christian's like that and they're a part of God, I don't want to be a part of God. So we got to find what led them to make this opinion, right? But again, debating and browbeating will not deal with the heart of the issue, right? We can give them all the facts in the world, but if we don't understand the heart of the issue, we're dealing with the wrong thing. Witnessing always has to start with meeting somebody where they're at, and that's understanding what led you here. And sometimes exploring the answer to this question and allowing them to kind of regurgitate allows some self-discovery on their part. You know, they may not even know. They may not even thought about it. It's just something they started believing and they kept to it. but it also gives them an opportunity to open their heart and mind to other ideas when they're not being attacked and browbeaten with concepts, right? And it shows that you care more about the person than you care about what they believe. That's the bottom line. You got to understand and let them believe what they believe. And in return, honestly, they might just want to know more about why you believe what you believe. And then they invite you into that conversation, and they invite you to share what you believe because you've opened that pathway for it, right? But always remember, we don't convince people to believe the truth. It is the Holy Spirit that convicts them of the truth. It is only our job to be vessels by knowing the truth and presenting it, right? Which leads me to another question, number 2. Have you read the Bible in its entirety to support your belief? So are you gaining this insight based on reading the Bible? Most likely, probably not, if they've actually read the whole Bible. Anyone who reads the fullness of Scripture, you will see God has ample amounts of grace and compassion throughout the Old Testament as well as the New Testament. And the New Testament is the ultimate fulfillment of that grace by wrath being poured out on Jesus, right? So it's all there. But ask them, do you know the covenants of God? Do you know how God dealt with the people? Like, do you know that most of them were only on him as unconditional? You know, exploring those questions, asking them about details within the Bible. Do you know that? Have you read that? Have you seen that? Do they realize that a majority of what God did was for them, rescuing them, redeeming them, right? Here, we have talked in depth about the fact that God's wrath and love are revealed in both Old Testament and New Testament. And if they have not read the whole Bible for true understanding, this question allows for opportunities to share what you have learned, right? Which means we have to know the Bible. We have to know the Bible in its entirety. And that requires that we study and are ready to give a response, right? 1 Peter 3:15 tells us that we are to be prepared to give a defense for our hope and faith, not be defensive, to defend in the sense of, I know what I believe, here's what I believe, here's why I believe it. Okay, giving an account, that's the word. But to give a verbal response, and it's to be done with gentleness and respect, right? But here's a few possibilities just to throw out at you. A, God's love is seen both Old Testament and New Testament. So the God of the Old Testament is not this relentless, bad-tempered taskmaster that some make him out to be. We know that. But do we have scripture that backs that up, right? Numbers 14:18 is a really good one. It tells us that the Lord is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, forgiving iniquity and transgression. That is not a God of wrath in that verse explained in the Old Testament. Exodus 34:6 repeats that very characteristic of God's character. Nehemiah 9:17, you are a God of forgiveness, gracious, and compassionate. These are all Old Testament beliefs, right? Psalms is full of it, but Psalm 103:9 tells us that he won't keep his anger forever. So yes, there is wrath, but there's a purpose for the wrath. But behind the wrath, there's compassion, right? I would encourage you to know some verses off the top of your head that you can point to and show them the context of which it was written, right? Know your stories. Know your Old Testament stories, how God showed his love through Esther and Joseph and Jonah and all the redemptive qualities of all these stories, right? His love is displayed throughout every single one of them, but we have to know them richly to regurgitate them for someone to hear, right? And likewise, flip that over, the God that revealed himself as such in the Old Testament is the same God who said he so loved the world that he gave his one and only son, right? John 3:16. 1 John 4:8 tells us that God is love. But most people understand the God of the New Testament to be love, right? But that doesn't mean God is only a kind, permissive, and doting grandfather-like figure, right? No, it doesn't mean that, which leads me to letter B. God's wrath is seen in both Old Testament and New Testament. Throughout the Old Testament, we see God dealing with Israel just as a loving father deals with a child, right? When they willfully sinned against him, worshiping idols, turning away from him, God would discipline them. It's just like when we are parents and we say, do not do that again, or this is what's going to happen, right? But people look at God and say, oh, he's mean for doing that, but not look at the people that disobeyed, right? Their discipline seems harsher for whatever reason. But again, they have the misconception of God. They're not understanding the bigger picture, right? God was disciplining them because of the dangers of them worshiping anything else but him. And they needed massive wake-up calls. We all know that. But each time that God poured out his wrath or disciplined them, he would offer an opportunity for deliverance once they returned and repented, right? People don't know that. They don't see that. Likewise, in the New Testament, Hebrews 12:6 tells us that the Lord disciplines the one he loves and chastises every son whom he receives. That's kind of a wrathful statement, right? 2 Thessalonians 1:8-10 refers to God taking vengeance on those who do not know God and do not obey the gospel. They will receive an everlasting destruction. And then again, Hebrews 10:30-31 warns that God will judge his people. It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. Why? Because he's a consuming fire. So there's both wrath in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. And the God who pours out wrath against sin in the Old Testament is the same God who will inflict the vengeance of eternal punishment on those who do not believe in his Son. But it is by the same love that began that pathway to redemption that Jesus came to take the wrath for all who choose to follow him, right? And this truth of God is unchanging. Malachi 3:6, the Old Testament says, I am the Lord, I do not change. The truth is echoed in New Testament, James 1:17, telling us that the Heavenly Father, there's no variation or change, right? There is consistency in the Old Testament and the New Testament, but you don't know it, you don't see it if you don't read all of it. But knowing those consistencies and knowing how to point them out is your best bet for responding to somebody who says that. But God's unchanging character is more than wrath and love, which leads me to another question. Are they limiting? Do they limit God to only two characteristics, wrath and love? Probably, right? If these are the only two qualities that they think God possesses, then sure, it's going to appear God was angry in the Old Testament and full of love in the New Testament. But there is so much more that drives those two responses of wrath and love. Just as humans have many more dimensions and emotions and characteristics, even more so does God, who we were created in his image, right? Pointing people to understand that we're created in the image of God. You have so much more than just anger and love, right? Understand a God that has so much more too. We can feel more than one feeling at a time. So can God. We were made in his image. God can be angry and full of love at the same time. Every parent knows that feeling, right? God can also be a jealous God. And jealousy leads to that love and that wrath. Do they understand that that's how passionate he loves? That he is the truth and that he operates justly? Do they understand that characteristic of God? That he cannot deny himself because of that truth and that just that he operates in? Do they see a God of wisdom who is seeing the big picture, who lays out the big picture, who holds it all in his hands? Do they understand that God has joy and sorrow? That he leaps for joy when someone returns to him, but he is sorrowful over the discipline. He's sorrowful over all the sadness that fills his heart when somebody turns away from him. Do they comprehend that he is holy and perfect, that he's good and righteous? If not, they're never going to see past the love and hate thing, the love and wrath. And because of God's righteous and holy character, all sin, past, present, and future has to be judged, right? Yet God in his infinite love has provided the payment for sin and a way of reconciliation so that sinful man can escape the wrath. So yes, God has wrath, but there's a pathway to escape it. Do they understand that? I could quote thousands and thousands and thousands of verses, but at the end of the day, helping someone see the fullness of God's character that drives his love and wrath is better than trying to argue the initial point, right? But the ultimate reality that is often deeply missed that we need to ask, question number 4 is, do they understand the relationship God is inviting them into and the consequence of denying that relationship? That is the deeper meaning behind the wrath and love, right? That's seen in both Old and New Testament. And your personal story of growth in relationship with Jesus is the best testimony to someone you know. They may be able to argue opinions of the Bible, but they can't debate what you have personally experienced God do in your own life. They can't argue with what your testimony of who God is in your life. They can doubt it for themselves, but they cannot deny it for you. Just like Tiffany said, somebody's no, what's this, right? Nobody can deny there's something happening in your life, right? That's how we are to present ourselves so that they do see the difference, right? Ultimately, often what draws people to seek the truth of God for themselves is how we express it in our relationship with them. And debating and arguing isn't the answer. It's offering conversation. Arguing doesn't change their perspective. Only patient and open conversations will lead someone to a deeper understanding of truth. So we have to be ready to offer that truth the way many spiritual giants throughout the entire Bible have done. So that's my encouragement with that answer to that question. It seems simplistic, but so often we want to defend with the facts when what we really need to do is get into the relationship of the conversation first. And those are just some questions that will help guide and direct some of those questions, some of those conversations, right? So I'm going to lead into a second question, because speaking of spiritual giants of the Bible, right, who were not afraid to speak the truth, that's how we're supposed to live. There are 2 examples that another question led me to think this really does tie in. Tiffany was asking about more information about Enoch and Elijah being raised up, right? And what that entailed. So I'm going to go through some details of that. And all of this does play together because we are supposed to be like a man of faith, like Enoch was. We are to be men and women of faith, like Elijah was, right? So I want to talk about them for a minute. So within the Bible, if you don't know this, there are 2 unique men, Elijah and Enoch, that for whatever reason, God allowed them to escape death. They did not die. They were just taken up to heaven. So I'm going to start by telling us what happened with Enoch. Enoch was the great-great-great-great-grandson of Adam. And he became the father of Methuselah, who was the grandfather of Noah, making Enoch the great-grandfather to Noah. Okay, so it's interesting to me, this is a side note, but Methuselah, who was his son, was the oldest man recorded in the Bible, dying at the age of 969. I just thought that was interesting. It bears no, weight on the whole story. But Enoch, however you want to say it, lived in an exceedingly evil period of history, right before the flood. Possibly the greatest time of evil the world has yet even seen. The world was full of violence, and all but Noah's family had turned away from God completely. But Enoch refuses in this time to be silenced about the corruption and godlessness around him. The book of Jude tells us that Enoch prophesied against his own wicked generation. And here's what it says. Jude 1:14 through 15. See, the Lord is coming with thousands upon thousands of his holy ones to judge everyone and to convict all of them of the ungodly acts they have committed in their ungodliness, and of all the defiant words ungodly sinners have spoken against him. This is Enoch speaking this to the corrupt evildoers of his time. I don't think he was very popular. I think he was hated and despised because he was willing to come against those who were against God. But in the midst of all that, he remained faithful to God. And Genesis 5:22 and 20 through 24 tells us that after he became the father of Methuselah, something happened. Scholars say after, that's a very poignant point. When he became a father, something really changed within him. Enoch, it says, walked faithfully with God 300 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Enoch lived in a total of 365 years. Enoch walked faithfully with God. Then he was no more because God took him away. So twice here we have he walked faithfully with God. That's an important factor in his character, right? Others are listed in Genesis 5 genealogy, and they all clearly died. But it says Enoch was no more, God took him. And the only explanation that we have of Enoch escaping death is Hebrews 11:5, where it says, by faith, Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. That is the only thing we have to go on as to why God decided to spare Enoch from death. It appears that Enoch was taken by God for his undying faith. But what about Elijah? Elijah lived many centuries after Enoch and is known for being both bold and compassionate at times and humanly tentative at others. He had the gamut, like David, the gamut of emotions Elijah did, right? But like Enoch, he existed during a very tumultuous time. Elijah existed when Israel was a divided kingdom. Under the northern kingdom of King Ahab was the ruler, and he was by far the most evil king in all of the history. So you have two separate centuries apart, evil leaders, evil times that these two men lived and remained in. It is Elijah, just like Enoch, who spoke up and prophesied against the wicked king. Elijah was one of the most powerful prophets, performing all these spectacular miracles like calling forth drought and rain. And like Enoch, he did not die, but he was taken up to heaven. And I'm going to read 2 Kings 2:9 through 12. This is how Elijah went to be with Jesus. It's interesting because Elijah knew it was coming. Elijah is out on a walk with his young prophet protege in training named Elisha. And Elijah, this is where I'm going to get, Elijah said to Elisha, his young protege, ask, what may I do for you before I'm taken away from you? So he knew, right? Elisha said, please let a double portion of your spirit be upon me. So he said, you have asked a hard thing. Nevertheless, if you see me when I am taken from you, it shall be so for you. But if not, it shall not be so. Verse 11, then it happened, as they continued on and talked, that suddenly a chariot of fire appeared with horses of fire and separated the two of them. Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven, and Elisha saw it, and he cried out, my father, the chariot of Israel and its horsemen. So he saw him, Elijah, no more. So that's a pretty spectacular exit. I would love to have an exit from her like that, right here, right now. But one thing that is unique about Elijah compared to Enoch is that it is predicted that he will return. Malachi 4:5 through 6 says, behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and awesome day of the Lord, and he will turn the hearts of fathers to their children and the hearts of children to their fathers, lest I come and strike the land with a decree of utter destruction. We do know, according to the 3 gospel accounts, that Elijah appeared in glorious splendor at the Mount of with Moses at the Mount of Transfiguration, right? And they were discussing his soon departure. But the great and awesome day of the Lord that he's referring to is the second coming. Although we are not specifically told why Enoch and Elijah were taken to heaven without dying, we do know that they shared one major common trait. They were both abundantly faithful during evil times. And not only in serving God, but also in obeying God. The Bible calls us to walk with God. Micah 6:8 says, He has shown you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? But to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. And the New Testament echoes this teaching when we are taught in Galatians to walk in the Spirit rather than in the flesh. We are called to walk as Enoch walked and Elijah. Again, the Bible doesn't say why they were taken without dying. However, we can speculate that God rewarded them for their faithful ministries during very evil times. We are called to do the same in our culture, right? But let me give you a couple of what scholars speculate as to possibly what will happen with Enoch and Elijah. So the book of Revelation, chapter 11, most of us know, it talks about 2 witnesses that will appear during the end times, right? These witnesses will have the power to shut up the heavens so that it will not rain while they were prophesying, and they have the power to turn the waters into blood and to strike the earth with every kind of plague as often as they want when they are witnessing. So these 2 witnesses, they will prophesy for about 1,260 days. That's about 3.5 years. Their main role is to testify about God during this time of tribulation. The names of these 2 witnesses is not mentioned. However, there are 3 speculations, there are 3 opinions as to who these witnesses will be. Some believe that the witnesses will be Enoch and Elijah. Could that be why God rescued them and allowed them to escape physical death? I'm going to read what a scholar wrote because they're way smarter than I am. One scholar says that proponents of this view point to Hebrews 9:7, which says that all men are appointed to die once. The fact that neither Enoch or Elijah has yet experienced death seems to qualify them for the job of the 2 witnesses, who will be killed when their job is done and then resurrected into heaven. In addition, both Enoch and Elijah were prophets who pronounced God's judgment. Interesting. However, I have to also mention that other scholars suggest that it will actually be Moses and Elijah as the 2 witnesses based on their biblical miracles and their appearance at the transfiguration of Jesus. One scholar writes, the witnesses will have the power to turn water into blood, which duplicates a famous miracle of Moses in Exodus 7. And the witnesses will have the power to destroy their enemies with fire, which corresponds to an event in Elijah's life, right? In 2 Kings. Further, Jewish tradition expects Moses and Elijah to return based on the prophecy of Elijah's coming in Malachi 4:5 that we read, and God's promise to raise up a prophet like Moses, which some Jews believe necessitates Moses' return. But it says raise up a prophet like Moses, not raise up Moses. So that's an interesting to me. But a third view is that the two witnesses will be 2 future men raised up by God, empowered to perform similar miracles, not anything to do with Moses, Elijah, Enoch, none of them. So, I mean, that one's a little extreme to me. I think God always has a purpose and a plan, right? And while nobody definitely knows, I do know that God has reasons for these 2 men that were faithful to escape death. And if nothing else, we should aspire to be a person who walked with God as Enoch walked. and who obeyed as Elijah obeyed, even to the point of risking his life, right? He spoke truth about a coming judgment. Do we do that? Do we do that? Do we tell people about the coming judgment, right? Or do we just fluff and buff Christianity and try to draw people in with the love factor? But you have to have both. You have to talk about the love and you have to talk about the wrath, right? Are we teaching our children, our grandchildren, our nieces, our nephews, the younger generation, that God is faithful to his word, that God is faithful to pour out his wrath, but he will also be faithful to pour out his love? And they have to make a choice. We have to be praying for the younger generation to surrender to this truth. And we are all living in a world of evil right now. I'm not trying to be dramatic, but when you have I just saw this is a tangent. A gal posted something that California is now making youth sign a I have mental disorder form. You saw this? Because they refuse to go into a transgender bathroom, sharing it with transgenders. Yeah. Guys, this is the things that we don't talk about enough. And do we understand that that evil is going to keep getting more prevalent in our world around us? We can't just be silent, you know? We can't just be silent. We have to pray for our younger generation. We have to be willing to be that light, that voice of truth, no matter what the cost is. But we have to do it by way of relationship. Standing on the street corner, shouting with a megaphone, that is not going to work. It almost always happens within relationship, right? And asking questions to get to know the person more than you know what they believe. We have to be willing to get out of our comfort zone, to speak up, to stop being passive Christians and step into a world where there is hate and there's apathy and there's darkness, and say that there is a better way, there's a better hope, regardless of what others think. I guess my question that I challenge myself with is, are we silent because God isn't asking us to speak? Or because culture has made it difficult for a believer to express their truth? Our belief system has to go past our salvation. It has to be a believer who's speaking truth and love and cares for the eternal destiny of everyone around us. God's telling us to do that. We know that. We know that. But are we listening and are we obeying the way Enoch and Elijah listened and obeyed?